The grand marble courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that carried weight, a silence that wasn't empty, but heavy, filled with tension, expectations, and unspoken thoughts. Then, the doors swung open. He walked in, confident, arrogant, untouchable. Richard Sterling had built his empire with the kind of ruthlessness that made headlines. A self-made billionaire, as he loved to remind people, though the details of how he climbed to the top were often left out. He didn't ask for respect that demanded it. His money was his shield, his power his sword. And now, standing in a courtroom, facing charges that should have humbled him, he remained just as defiant. His designer suit, a shade darker than his ego, was tailored to perfection. The expensive watch on his wrist gleamed under the fluorescent lights as he adjusted his cufflinks with deliberate slowness. As if he had all the time in the world, he smirked as he looked around. To him, this was just another Gemeiner inconvenience to brush aside. But then, she walked in. Judge Elana Monroe. She was younger than he expected, black, composed, a woman who had earned every inch of her authority, and unlike him, she didn't wear power like an accessory. She carried it in her presence, in her words, in the way she looked at a man and made him feel small without ever raising her voice. Richard barely glanced at her. To him, she was just another person who didn't matter, another name in the long list of people he could buy, threaten, or manipulate. He had done it before judges, politicians, CEOs. Everyone had a price. But the moment she took her seat and spoke, something shifted. "Mr. Sterling, you may rise." Her voice was firm, unshaken, but he didn't move. Instead, he leaned back, crossed his legs, and let out a small chuckle, shaking his head as if this was amusing to him. "I don't stand for anyone, sweetheart," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. The room froze. The prosecutor's jaw clenched. The court clerk's fingers tightened on her notepad. Even the guards exchanged glances, as if they were bracing for the impact of what had just been said. But Judge Monroe? She didn't flinch. She didn't raise an eyebrow, didn't frown, didn't even look surprised. Instead, she simply stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, with the calmest voice, she leaned slightly forward and said, "Then, Mr. Sterling, I suppose you'll have no problem staying exactly where you are, for a very, very long time." The air in the courtroom shifted. Richard's smirk faded. For the first time, there was a flicker of something in his eye, something that looked dangerously close to doubt. Because for the first time in his life, he realized he was not in control. And what happened next would change everything. The courtroom was thick with silence, but it was the kind that spoke louder than words. Richard Sterling sat there, his smirk gone, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to being challenged. His whole life, doors had opened for him before he even knocked. Laws bent, rules broke, and people folded in his presence. He had expected today to be no different. Just another judge, another legal proceeding that would end in his favor. But Judge Elana Monroe? She wasn't playing his game. Richard shifted in his seat, glancing around the courtroom. His high-powered attorney, a man who usually oozed confidence, suddenly looked uncomfortable. The prosecutor was watching with interest, his lips pressed together like he was holding back a smirk. Even the bailiff stood a little straighter. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. Judge Monroe let the silence stretch just long enough to remind Richard, who was in control before she spoke again. "Mr. Sterling, let me remind you are in my courtroom. I don't care how many billions you have, how many people have let you slide in the past, or how important you think you are. Here, the law is the only power that matters." Richard exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. "This is a joke." "No, Mr. Sterling," Judge Monroe said smoothly. "This is justice, and you do well to respect it." His fingers drummed against the table. He could feel the weight of the room pressing in on him. He didn't like this feeling, this loss of control. He had built an empire by always being 10 steps ahead, by making sure the rules bent to his will, but for the first time, he felt something foreign clawing at him. Was it doubt? Number? It couldn't be. He leaned toward his attorney. "Fix this." His lawyer cleared his throat, standing up. "Your Honor, I'd like to request a recess. Denied. Judge Monroe said without hesitation. Richard narrowed his eyes. He wasn't used to hearing that word either. He had underestimated her. He thought she would be intimidated by his name, his wealth, his presence. But Judge Monroe wasn't intimidated. She wasn't even fazed. And now, for the first time in his life, Richard Sterling realized he wasn't the one holding the cards. Outside the courtroom, reporters swarmed the steps, cameras flashing, as soon as the heavy wooden doors swung open. Mr. Sterling, do you have any comments on today's hearing? Do you think your influence can get you out of this? Judge Monroe seems determined. Are you worried? Richard didn't answer. He didn't even slow his stride. His driver was already waiting by the curb, the sleek black car gleaming under the afternoon sun. As he slid into the back seat, his attorney followed, shutting the door behind them. What the hell was that? Richard snapped. His lawyer wiped his brow, loosening his tie. That judge, she's not like the others. She's not looking for a deal. She's got a reputation for being tough on people like you. Richard scoffed. People like me? Powerful men who think they're untouchable. The words hung in the air. Richard looked out the window, his jaw clenching. He had always thought himself untouchable, always believed that as long as he had money, he had control. But today, something shifted. For the first time, he had met someone he couldn't buy. And he hated it. As the car weaved through the city, his mind raced. He needed leverage, something to put this judge in her place. He had brought down bigger opponents before. Judge Monroe was just another obstacle he would crush. Or so he thought. Because what he didn't know was that Alana Monroe had spent her whole life standing up to men like him. And she had no intention of backing down. That night, Richard Sterling sat in his penthouse, staring out at the city skyline. Normally, this view made him feel invincible, like he owned everything beneath him. But tonight, it felt different. It felt distant, out of reach. Judge Alana Monroe had done something no one else had ever managed. She had made him feel small. His phone buzzed. "It's handled?" he asked without greeting. His attorney's voice was hesitant. "Not exactly. She's clean, Richard. No skeletons, no scandals, no political ambitions we can use against her. If anything, her record is spotless. She doesn't just talk about justice, she lives by it. People respect her." Richard exhaled sharply. "Everyone has a weakness." "Maybe, but she's not playing your game." Richard ended the call without another word. He had spent his life believing that power was the only thing that mattered. That with enough money, influence, and connections, there was no door he couldn't open, no problem he couldn't make disappear. But what did you do when you met someone who didn't care about any of that? The next morning, the courtroom was packed again. The air was thick with anticipation. This wasn't just another case anymore, it was a battle. Richard walked in, his confidence forced, his mind racing. His attorneys had found nothing to use against Judge Monroe, but he still refused to believe he could lose. She sat at the bench, calm as ever, her eyes sharp. "Mr. Sterling, let's continue." His lawyer stood, ready to argue, but before he could speak, Richard did something no one expected. He stood. For the first time, not out of arrogance, not out of defiance, but because something inside him had shifted. He didn't like it. He didn't understand it. But for the first time, he realized that respect wasn't something you demanded. It was something you earned. Judge Monroe nodded ever so slightly, acknowledging the change. Then, with steady authority, she read the final ruling. Richard Sterling guilty. The courtroom erupted. Some gasped. Some whispered. The media outside was already scrambling to break the news. Richard stood frozen. He had always assumed he was untouchable. But now, reality was crashing down on him. There were no deals, no loopholes, no last-minute saves. This time, justice had won. As the guards approached, Richard Sterling locked eyes with Judge Monroe one last time. There was no hatred in her gaze, no gloating, just quiet certainty. This wasn't personal. It was right. And deep down, for the first time in his life, Richard understood the difference.